Welcome back to my channel for another video, and this video is about the new firmware 4.0 for the Leica SL2. I have two SL2s in front of me on the table. Let's get started. In the title of this video, I included the Leica SL2-S because all the firmware changes and new features you get on the SL2, you kind of also get on the SL2-S, and there are only tiny little differences which I will point out at the end of the video. The reason why you see two SL2 cameras here in front of me on the table is not because you all of a sudden see double. It's because intentionally on this SL2 I'm still on firmware 3.0, whereas here on this one I upgraded to firmware 4.0, so we can put them side by side and detect together all the differences and the new features of the new firmware. For the firmware update process, I recommend to follow one-on-one the instructions provided by Leica in a little PDF booklet which you can download in the same place where you downloaded the firmware. If you follow these instructions, it will take you on the camera in the menu to the update firmware screen, and then you can decide whether you want to upgrade to firmware 4.0. If in this menu you choose yes, the camera will take you into another menu screen where you can decide whether you want to save your customized profiles on the SD card, and if you have customized your camera, I fully recommend doing so. No matter what you decide here, the next push on the joystick will actually start the firmware updating process. Make sure your battery is fully charged, make sure you don't interrupt it, it might break your camera. Just watch and wait until the process is finalized. If you restart then the camera, you get automatically into a lens update process, and that's super convenient with Leica because in the firmware for the camera body is already incorporated updates the lens needs which is mounted on the camera, and whenever you mount some other Leica SL lens, only original Leica SL lenses, the camera will automatically detect whether that lens is already upgraded to be compatible with the camera body firmware 4.0. If no, then the lens update process starts and that newly mounted lens will be upgraded in its firmware to play nicely with firmware 4.0 on the Leica SL2 or the SL2-S. If you completed all these steps, you will be awarded with a message or notification like you see it here on the live screen of the camera, which says update successful. You need to restart the camera again. You might need to adjust some settings, and if you had profiles stored on your SD card, make sure you re-import them into the camera to have your customizations back which you set up before, and then you're good to go to shoot with the new firmware 4.0 on the Leica SL2 and the SL2-S. So let's kick this off with the first change from 3.0 to 4.0. So let's have a look into this SL2 first. And if we do that and go into the menu, let me quickly do that. On page number 5, we find camera information. And on camera information, we see we are here at firmware 3.0. The first new feature I want to discuss concerns control wheels. And on the SL2 we have two control wheels. One is here at the top of the camera, and Leica calls this the front wheel, and then there is one at the rear side of the camera, and Leica calls this the thumb wheel, and for good reasons of course, because this is the way you operate it with your thumb. The front wheel as well as the thumb wheel can be customized even on firmware 3.0. So in the menu on customize control, you go to wheel assignment. You can do this for autofocus and manual lenses, works kind of the same. And then we have an organization here in a two-dimensional matrix, and the rows you have, they are assigned to the shooting mode like program, shutter priority, aperture priority and manual mode, and your columns are headlined by thumb wheel and front wheel. For program mode now, I can either have program shift on thumb wheel and exposure compensation on front wheel, or if I push the joystick, I swap the two functions and then they are assigned to the respective other control wheel. The same as what I just showed on program mode, I can also do on shutter priority. So here we have shutter speed on the thumb, and on the front we have exposure compensation, and then I can just exchange the two and basically swap them, and in this way I can customize what function is at the front and what function is at the rear side on the thumb wheel. Same for aperture priority, same actually for manual mode, where I obviously have to change the aperture and the shutter speed. So now on the thumb wheel here I control aperture, and on the top wheel or front wheel I control shutter speed. Now I can just swap them, and then I have here shutter speed and here the aperture. So quite simple, but not a lot to customize, which we'll see has changed in firmware 4.0. I replaced now the camera body with firmware 3.0 by this one here, where we have firmware 4.0 installed. Let's quickly verify that here. So here you see camera firmware version is now 4.0. So we are actually good to go again into customize control, and that is here, and look into the same menu entry as we just did for the former firmware. And if we go into that, we have the same matrix structure. So we have the shooting modes and we have the thumb wheel and the front wheel, but now we can directly use these control wheels to change the setting. And if I go for the thumb wheel column here in program mode, I can choose program shift, I can choose ISO, and that's new. ISO as an exposure related setting is now included in all of the options here. And of course I have exposure compensation, and then it starts the cycle all over again. And that is quite nice. I can also use directly the front wheel to go through the same cycle of 3 different assignments for this control wheel here. And that is, I think, an improvement because it gives you more flex. The same works on the other settings. Let's go, for instance, into manual mode. And in manual mode, I have here the option aperture, then ISO, and then shutter speed. So before we had a one-on-one relationship between 2 functions on 2 control wheels, and the only customization we could do is swapping them. Now we have 3 functions which are possible to be assigned to the control wheels, and we can choose here whatever we want. We can even choose them to be the same, whatever is best for our own workflow. Here's the setting I'm going to choose here. Clearly that's a matter of taste, but on program mode, which I hardly use, actually I never use it, I would see on the thumb wheel program shift, front wheel exposure compensation, aperture priority. I want to control here with my thumb the aperture, but on top with the front wheel, I'd rather control ISO than exposure compensation. And the same applies to shutter speed priority. And then on manual mode, clearly I want to have the 2 main parameters, aperture and shutter speed. So that's the way I'm going to set this up. Let's quickly look into the options we get on manual lenses. And the assumption here is that aperture priority happens actually just on the lens and not on the camera body. And that's why you have here magnification, ISO and exposure compensation, which you can assign to both wheels in an independent way. And you have, of course, the fully manual mode, but here you don't have aperture to assign because again, that happens on the manual lens, and only shutter speed happens on the camera body as well as magnification. Makes perfectly sense for me. Let's quickly see what we have in video mode here. So let's swipe and then we are in the video mode. Let's go into the menu. Customize control here is on page number 3. Let's go into the wheel assignment for autofocus lenses and let's see what we have. On the thumb wheel, microphone gain, exposure compensation and ISO. That's what we get in program mode. In the same for the front wheel, of course. And we can choose here whatever we want. Then we can go down to aperture priority. Here we have on the thumb side, aperture, exposure compensation and ISO. And the same applies on shutter speed priority. No microphone gain, but exposure compensation, ISO and shutter speed. And in fully manual mode the same. So that's the way it is set up in video mode. The next new feature is sleep in Wi-Fi mode. And for this you need to first of all have connected your SL2 to your Photos app on the iPhone. And then you will see the menu entry. So let's go on page number 5. And on page number 5 we have the Leica Photos entry. Then you can toggle Bluetooth, you have remote wake up, and what's new is the Wi-Fi sleep mode. And that's an interesting one because you can say after 5 minutes of inactivity the Wi-Fi sleep mode kicks in, or you can say no, don't go to bed today but maybe tomorrow, or you can keep Wi-Fi active at all times. And that's clearly an interesting feature for operating your Wi-Fi connectivity to your smartphone via the Leica Photos app. The next feature is finally eye detection. And so far we had in the menu, let me quickly go there here. I'm here on field, and if I go to the very right hand side, we have eye, face, body detection. So far we only had face and body detection, but eye detection was not incorporated. And that's an algorithm Leica now implemented. So let's try this out and let's see what it is capable of. So guys, this new eye detection feature for the Leica SL2 and the SL2-S is quite complex and sophisticated. And it works like a charm. I'm trying to illustrate it here by 2 static models in front of me on the table. If I focus here and I have a very shallow depth of field with wide open f2.0, you see 2 frames, one around the body of the model in the background and one around the face of the left hand side model. Actually, if you turn it around, it's on the right hand side facing us. around the face. You also see two dots in that rectangle, in the green rectangle where currently the focus is sitting. And if I keep pushing halfway the shutter button down, I can toggle between the eyes. You see now one eye is green and the other one is white. And now I toggled and the other one is green and the former one is white. So I can actually choose by using the joystick what eye is here selected as my focus point, and that's quite nice. I can also switch frames here. So if I swipe the joystick now, then I can get the focus on the other model, which is a bit in the background, and my former model gets a bit fuzzy based on the shallow depth of field. Here, the eyes are not really visible because it's not a real model. That's why we have only here body detection and not face or eye detection. If I swap back to the model, so the female model here, I again get face detection and also both eyes are detected and I can toggle, between both eyes here, if you look at that. That's quite nice. So it's a complex feature and you can in a very dedicated way pick the eye you want to have by halfway pressing the shutter button and then toggling between the eyes. That's quite nice. I think Leica implemented this in a terrific way and I like a lot this new feature that finally we have eye detection on the Leica SL2 and the SL2-S. The next feature is the opportunity to mark your images as favorites, and you can then select later 4 favorites and either keep them, or if you do it in an inverted way, delete them if you flip through your images quickly in the camera. And this is done via this function button here, and typically if you press and hold this in the shooting mode, you can choose here all types of functions you want to have. So for instance, magnification, and then if I push the button, I get my magnification on the model. Let's focus first, then let's zoom in, and you get a nice magnified representation of that particular part of the image. So that's the way this works, but in play mode, this function button not really had a job to do. So if you are in play mode now, I think we shot that image just a moment ago, you can now use that to tag photos with a star here or a marker as a favorite. And you can also remove it, you can mark it, and then as I said, in direct or inverted ways, you can use this for quick selection of photos. For the next feature, I quickly switched to the camera body with firmware 3.0, and I want to go into power saving. So we go on page 5 into camera settings, and then we go into power saving. And what we find here is the usual auto power off, but we also find all displays auto off. And you could choose here between 5 minutes, 1 minute, and 30 seconds. And that has changed now because there is a different feature included in the new firmware 4.0. If in 4.0 we go to that same menu entry, so here on the camera settings in power saving, we have the same auto power off, which we saw before in the usual way, but here it says something different. It says displays off on auto mode, but also autofocus off. And the autofocus in particular, if it is in continuous mode, is permanently hunting for focus, is consuming a lot of power. So here now you can switch in combination with the displays, also the autofocus off. And if I go into that, I get 30 seconds, 1 minute, 5 minutes, which is what we had before, but I can also completely deactivate that auto power off feature here. And that is quite nice, I think, because again, it's a tiny little detail, but it gives you more flex in your workflow and in the way you operate the camera. The next new function we have here is called toggle focus point, and that's an interesting one, which I can easily demonstrate. I'm here on field focus, so I have an autofocus field here, and you have to assign this function to a function button. So let's do this with this button this time. Let's press and hold, let's scroll through the options, and then here we come to toggle focus point. So if this is chosen now, I can do the following. I can select a focus point here with that field, let's say on the face of the model, and let me focus. That's fine. If I now push that toggle button, it jumps back to the center of the frame, but it remembered where I focused before, and if I push it again, it goes back to that position. And that's of course interesting for metering in 2 different areas in the frame and seen in front of you, but also for taking focus in 2 different areas in the frame in front of you. And I think is a quite nice feature. It can be programmed easily and it works like a charm. The last feature I want to discuss and demonstrate before wrapping up the video is exposure and depth of field simulation. And that has to be assigned again to a function button. So let's take this one again. We had before here toggle focus point. Now let's go to exposure depth of field simulation. And now what happens is the following. I'm here still in aperture priority, and currently the camera indicates an ISO of 400. I shoot widest open at f2.0 and 1/400 seconds. Now, if I focus here, everything is fine. I get a simulation of my exposure in the live view. But if I now start to stop down here, let's do this, I think, aggressively until f16. I still get the same brightness, and what you also see, I still get the same shallow depth of field. And the reason is, before I not finally take the shot, the lens is kept widest open in order to being able to focus even in dimmer light and a low light environment. And that's why I don't actually see my depth of field here when I focus and not release the shot. If I now toggle that depth of field preview button here, and I want you to focus on the live view, not on my finger pushing that button, you will see how the depth of field in the live view is changing from that shallow depth of field view we currently have to a true depth of field represented by an f16. So have a look, I push it, 3, 2, 1, go. Did you see how the depth of field is changing? And that's the DOF preview, which is also indicated by a green F here next to f16. I switched now to fully manual mode and I'm at an ISO of 400. Still I stopped down to f16. We discussed depth of field preview a moment ago. And clearly if I focus now here at 1/20 seconds and f16, I get a dark frame and I don't see my depth of field. Now if I push that button again, it gives me the correct depth of field preview, and it also immediately corrects the light. And if I push it again, I also get the correct preview on the shutter speed side here, 1/20 seconds, which typically, if I deactivate all this, I only get when I halfway press the shutter button and it meters light and takes focus. So here I just have to push this button now, correct depth of field, correct exposure, and the way it is really set up here with shutter speed and aperture. And that's a function which I personally appreciate. And on typical DSLRs, this was at the front side of the camera body where you could use depth of field preview. Quite nice that Leica implemented this here. Let's wrap up the video. So here is the download page where you can download the firmware as well as release notes. And I want to quickly go through them. That takes not more than a minute to see what else is included in the new firmware 4.0 for the SL2 and the SL2-S. Let's start with the release notes for the SL2, and I covered everything in detail except 3 items on that first page of the release notes. I did not speak about additional function support for L-mount Alliance lenses, which is natural because of that cooperation between Leica, Sigma and Panasonic. I did not mention that ISO settings are now available in finer increments and that there are also bug fixes in the firmware. And then there is a second page with a bit more detail on the release notes, which I'm going to show here, where the only improvement on the photo side I did not mention is improved geotagging via the Leica Photos app on the iPhone. And then on the video side, 3 improvements. One is aperture setting in t-stops, 1/2 and 1/3 increments in the cine mode, and then some compatibility improvements on HDMI output for the Leica Photos app and USB connections. Comparing the release notes for the SL2 and the SL2-S, it turns out that everything we mentioned so far is also newly available on the SL2-S. Plus, there is one additional new feature, which is raw format output via HDMI for external device recording. And that's for lucky owners of the SL2-S only and not for the SL2, if I'm not mistaken in my research on the release notes. In all the new features, I liked most the new eye detection feature because that is really well done and totally impressed me when I tried it out. And if you like this video, then don't forget to drop me a thumbs up. Stay tuned on my channel. There's always more to come. Thanks for watching. Stay safe and healthy. And of course, peace out.